Hi, I'm here to discuss Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis to take us through a few important points in this graphic novel, which is set during the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And Marjane Satrapi begins this graphic novel, Persepolis, with a chapter called The Veil. Just want to point out that on this very first page, she takes advantage. It's a black and white graphic novel. And notice just in that very first image across the top where the veil is actually in the receded part of the image, and her eye is the more prominent part. And I want to just think about for us how she thinks about foregrounding imagery and also removing things and putting them in the in the background. And she does a lot of playing with distance, with angles, with what you can see and can't see in these images. That has a lot to do with her perception of this experience. The graphic novel really is a coming of age novel. It begins when she's 10, and this first novel ends when she's 14 years old and sent by her family to a French school in Vienna because of the upheaval during the revolution. So that very first panel that we see there is an image of Satrapi. This is me when I was 10 years old. This was in 1980. So it's almost an autobiography that we're getting in this graphic novel. And then she does a very interesting thing here where she says, and this is a class photo. I'm sitting on the far left, so you don't see me. From left to right, Golnaz, Mashid, Nareen, and Minna. And it's interesting that she immediately puts this drawing of a photo, cuts herself out of the photo so you could see her in her complete self and then only the side of her. And, look at how almost indistinguishable these young women are, especially in the veil. She sets out in the beginning this in 1979, a revolution took place. It was later called the Islamic Revolution. Then came 1980, the year it became obligatory to wear the veil at school. And that's her experience of this transformation. Satrapi said that she wanted to write this Persepolis based on the article you've read that depicted her life during this time, and that she didn't really find that most depictions of her experience resonated with her own. In other words, didn't give a sense of the normalcy of the world at the same time, at the very tense situation in the way in which her family was embroiled in all the elements of this overturning of government. So I just want you to, take note at times of the way she uses perspective, the way she uses the sort of description at the top often, in addition to these, conversation bubbles here, where and so she gives you this kind of combined sense of narrator and dialogue at the same time. So when she says we didn't really like to wear the veil, especially since we didn't understand why we had to, she then depicts this kind of scene of chaos on the playground. It's too hot out. Execution in the name of freedom. Give me my veil back. You'll have to lick my feet. Giddy up. And so they're using the veil in all these different ways. Ooh, I'm the monster of darkness, sort of making fun of the veil in a way. And I want to remind you as you're reading this book that humor was very important to Satrapi, and that looking at the perspective from her childlike perspective here, but also from this sort of very humorous, kind of ironic, almost cynical voice that her character of Margie has. I'm going to skip ahead to a more serious moment on page 54, which is when, she has these two relatives come back to see them. She has various relatives who've been in and out of torture and prison, both under the Shah and also under the fundamentalist regime. And so you get, this discussion where she's constantly kind of overhearing. She's the only child of these parents, and she's hearing from these older men who've been in prison. They whipped me with thick electric cables so much that this looks like anything but a foot, not to mention putting out their cigarettes on our backs and thighs as he's smoking a cigarette. My parents were so shocked that they forgot to spare me this experience. And then you get that kind of narrator voice coming in again. And then it's almost like she kind of zooms into the experience, whether is either her imagination and combined with what she's hearing about the torture that happened. They burned him with an iron, but then in this graphic novel, she's able to kind of take that symbol of torture, which is actually a domestic item, and have this sort of jarring moment where she says, "I never imagined that you could use that appliance for torture." And that, in a way, is the way she is able to take the everyday and turn it into something horrible or dangerous. And that happens to her throughout the graphic novel. Just want to jump ahead here to how she then translates this idea of torture. And again, this is where her kind of like cynical, sort of biting humor, but also from a childlike perspective, comes in. She says, these stories, she's out on the playground, these stories had given me new ideas for games. And then you see what the games are. The one who loses will be tortured. Yeah, what kind of torture? And then she lists the kind of things: the twisted arm, the mouth filled with garbage. Back at home that evening, I had a diabolical feeling of power, and you get to see the image of her looking at herself in the mirror, but now she's got the devil's horns. But it didn't last. I was overwhelmed. She's turned, she's in tears. And then the mother, and there's often this shading that gives this sense of kind of impending doom in this house. Don't cry, they will pay for what they've done. I thought one should forgive. And then she kind of moves from this sort of realistic portrait of the conversation with the mother to what she frequently has in the book, which is this kind of relationship to God, which she imagines as this kind of comforting character in the beginning. She says, I didn't know what justice was now that the revolution was finally over once and for all. I abandoned the dialectic materialism of my comic strips. The only place I felt safe was in the arms of my friend, and that is God for her. And she also, acknowledges that a lot of her philosophy and understanding comes from these comic strip books that her parents have given her about principles of Marxism and communism. So the next section I just want to call your attention to is on page 76, and that is the way that her ability to get education and her conflict in these educational settings really comes to life. We see that some days later, and that's how she shows the passage of time here, the Ministry of Education has decreed that universities will close at the end of the month. Oh no. And so now we're getting the TV speaking. She frequently does that. We have the TV commenting, and we hear what it is, that they're going to shutter the schools because they're really, the students are being educated to be future imperialists, and so they want to reformulate the educational system. And this is where the parents really start to realize that this revolution, which they had all celebrated to get rid of the Shah, actually is potentially going to, or is inaugurating, a more repressive regime than they had been in before. As the mother says, you'll see soon they're actually going to force us to wear the veil, and you'll have to trade your car for a camel. God, what a backward policy. And then you have this, I wanted to point out this moment because you have all these kind of narrative shifts, and she does so much in one page of this book because she leaps from the official announcement on the television, the closing of the universities, her parents' distress in their dialogue, to in this panel, her sort of voiceover saying, no more university, and I wanted to study chemistry. I wanted to be like Marie Curie. And so then we've also got this kind of fantasy life that she has in her head of imagining herself as a kind of Marie Curie French scientist who got the Nobel Prize for discovering radium. So she's able to sort of comment on her experience while experiencing it at the same time. And that's a really important thing that she's able to do in this graphic novel. I will just show you one more thing, kind of technique that she uses, which is to show a kind of before and after in a very graphic way of what their life was like before. She shows you on the left here this picture of the modern woman. In no time, the way people dressed became an ideological sign, meaning it indicated where they were on the political spectrum. There were two kinds of women, the modern women and the fundamentalist woman. And there were also two sorts of men, the fundamentalist man and the progressive man. And so she also is able to use this kind of showing in this graphic novel of side-by-side comparisons of things without, it being part of explicitly a narration story, but as a kind of example of what's happening and how things have changed. I just want to go quickly to one of the important things that main reason she said she wrote the book was to demonstrate that in spite of the repression, the fear of the torture, the repression of having to wear the veil, that her experience as a child growing up was not an entirely negative and dour one. And so she has this moment where she depicts the parties that they were throwing even after the Islamic Revolution. And she says, in spite of all the dangers the parties went on, without them it wouldn't have been psychologically bearable, some said. Without parties, we might as well just bury ourselves now, added the others. My uncle invited us to his house to celebrate the birth of my cousin. Everyone was there, even Grandma was dancing. And, you see the struggles they have, the power outage, they get the candles, they've lost music. Her father plays the drum and adds to the music. And even though they're not supposed to have alcohol in the country anymore, they had everything because the uncle was making winemaking in the basement, and Miss Nazarene, who was also his cleaning lady, was crushing the grapes. And you have this moment of humor where she's, stomping on the grapes in the bathtub and saying, God forgive me, God forgive me. And you see that there's a kind of, in these panels, a kind of joy in, even though they are in the worst of circumstances. Part of the reason I'm interested in this book for us to look at is to think about the ways in which we are asked to shut things down, or we have been during this pandemic, and how that affects the way we behave and how difficult it is to let go of sort of natural human contact and human relations that, we had been asked to do. Thankfully, not so much now. And obviously, this is a much worse situation that Satrapi lived through. My last point that I just want to make quickly about the novel is on page 116, and that is where, there's constantly a tension between Margie having to not argue back, control herself, wear the veil, can't wear Western clothes, and there's tension with her parents, too, who are pretty strict with her in a sense, even though they are at the same time much more, sort of modernized parents. And she says, she had skipped school to go downtown with two friends and see some boys. And the mother has found out about it. And, she accuses her of lying. And, you see the tension between the young 13, 14-year-old and her mother. And then the mother directly, you tell me the truth right now or else you'll be punished twice. And then the daughter's commentary, my mother used the same tactics as the torturers. And, the daughter is lying again. And then the mother, we get this speech bubble that says, you lied again. The school called and said you had grammar. And and then she plays with the foreground and the distance, right, in this panel, where you've probably had this experience of your mother shouting at you, and at a certain point you kind of almost tune them out. And the daughter responds in this kind of hostile way, saying, "Dictator, you're the guardian of the revolution in this house." And I just want to pause here a minute to think about the way that this story of coming of age is about a kind of needing to throw off repression or oppression, and that it doesn't only come from the government, but it's also coming from the family structure itself, from that kind of generational idea of the way in which her parents are asking her to lock down her feelings, keep herself contained. And I think that's a theme we've been seeing through a lot of these texts that we're reading, is in what ways does the older generation expect, maybe unreasonably, young people to follow some strictures and some rules that they perhaps don't even buy into. So I hope you enjoy reading this book, and check out the other materials I have up for you. Okay.